I was in London for a speech that I gave to people on securities fraud. One person put up his hand and said, you know, I'm having trouble with this warning that I was given by my travel agent about going to New York. Can you interpret this for me? And it was a list of 10 things to do or not do to avoid being the victim of crime in New York. I said to myself, who would go to a city where you have to be given 10 warnings you won't get killed?
In 1990, the city had an Eastern European look in the sense that it had an overwhelming grayness.
I remember I was walking in Times Square. I knew, I wasn't worried, I knew that in 20 seconds somebody would accost me for some reason.
Bad schools, high crime, not the greatest economic vibrancy.
If you had a car, you'd put a sign in the window that said, no radio in here, so that someone wouldn't come along and smash it up. And there were people begging everywhere.
It was terrible. The city wasn't safe, and we almost went bankrupt.
Most of the parks had not had any investment in them for years or decades. There was a lot of crime, there was a lot of graffiti. Bryant Park being one of the worst. It had 500 felonies in 1979, which is a lot of felonies.
The airport was like a third world country. The highways were filthy, abandoned cars, tires, grass overgrown everywhere on the center islands, graffiti everywhere. It was just bedlam. Every day, everybody was victimized by the fear-inducing quality of life decay and disorder in the city. In 1990, worst crime year in the history of New York City, 500,000 serious crimes reported: murders, rapes, robberies, burglaries, car thefts.
You had to literally fear for your life. And I remember people telling me that, you know, I always keep a $10 or $20 bill inside of my cigarette pack because let's say if I left my wallet somewhere, I'd never leave my cigarettes anywhere. And you never want someone to come up to you to rob you and you have nothing to offer, because that might anger the individual and you might be one of those 2,500 people that lost their life that year. And I'm saying to myself, like, wow, how did we get here?
I'm John Lindsay. I was born in New York City and I've lived here all my life. And I'm running for mayor because I know that our city is in a crisis.
I plan to give New York the most hardworking, the most dedicated, and I hope the most exciting and successful administration this city has ever seen.
Mayor Lindsay in the late 1960s, he was supposed to be a new mayor to address new problems.
Before this very day is over, someone will be murdered, children will be bitten by rats, Negroes will be denied jobs because of their race, 50,000 drug addicts will need another fix, 50 jobs will leave the city, countless families will be without water, without heat, and all of us will breathe the deadly air that is the same as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes.
He was relatively young, in his early 40s. He was fresh-faced, he was blonde, he was handsome.
I think John Lindsay, by and large, was a very positive figure in the beginning. There was this sense of the country was changing. The 60s, early on particularly, was a hopeful time. And John Lindsay, I think, represented that hope to a lot of people.
Well, the most extraordinary thing about John Lindsay was that he had total confidence in all of his ideas, which were all wrong.
The sounds of New York are the sounds of the drillers into the rock, of the iron workers and all the clangor that says, my skyline, my ever-changing skyline.
New York is in the middle of an enormous economic boom, the greatest boom in its history.
In this restless, bustling city, always fascinating, always inspiring, ever new, New York.
And it's during that period that Lindsay explodes the welfare rolls.
We can get these folks off the streets, we can put an end to this crime, and in time we can have the great society that we're all entitled to.
As part of all the Great Society initiatives, the city was expanding its social services safety net. And the city was known for having pretty generous welfare benefits.
John Lindsay basically encouraged the city to get more and more people onto welfare at that time. He spent money on expanding a whole set of welfare agencies whose job was to reduce poverty, but simply created poor people as clients who then became a permanent underclass. So the roles just expanded incredibly. But it also affected the other parts of the city and the quality of life.
What you've just seen is the most devastated area in New York City. The rest of the country hears about Harlem all the time. Harlem, compared to Brownsville, is a stable middle-class community by comparison.
He was just overwhelmed with these problems that kind of started to balloon and mushroom in the early 1970s.
When he took office in 1966, there were roughly 600 murders. And when he left, 8 years later, there were approximately 1,700 murders a year.
This crisis and this administration has failed even to make a proposal to protect our people on the streets and in their homes from violence.
Well, I don't think that this is the time for partisan statements.
He essentially drove jobs out of the city. The single biggest reason that companies left the city was crime.
When Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy took over the NYPD in the early 1970s, his focus was reducing systemic corruption within the department. But what he did also, he had us in uniform stop making narcotic arrests. The one thing that was true then and today, there's a nexus between illegal narcotic activity and violent crime in New York City.
He was sort of a proto-perpetrator of the phony narrative that colorblind institutions dedicated to law and order are racist. He believed that excusing crime was doing people a favor. It was not. So he did not use the police department as he should have to try and stem what became a completely out of control urban breakdown.
It also sends a message out to the police officers that really nothing is expected of you. If you just play it safe, don't do anything. Don't get in trouble and you'll get your pension and you'll get out of here.
They robbed me. They robbed me. And if you don't think I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna kill them up my fist.
People would call about a narcotic complaint. A uniformed officer would arrive and drive away because they weren't supposed to be enforcing the laws. You develop this dynamic between the people in the community wondering, why aren't the cops doing something about the drugs?
The only people who profit from this are the people who are preying on the average citizens.
Crime explodes, and businesses feel this, and if they can, they get out of the city.
This fiscal year, well, it's quite grim. For the first time since I've been mayor, we are in imbalance at the moment. It's conceivable we'd have to go to the banks to get through the year. It would be terrible if we had to do that because it just compounds the problem for the next fiscal year.
He spent money the city didn't have, and he spent money the city was never going to have. I mean, it was borrow and spend. There was just a lack of discipline. And when the banks eventually said, that's it, we're not going to lend you anymore because we don't believe you can repay it, that's what created the great fiscal crisis, which ended up worsening everything in the city.
We saw immediate population destabilization. The city lost about 1 million people, lost a lot of middle-class families, middle-class jobs. We lost a lot of corporate headquarters. We were the capital of garment manufacturing. Those jobs went to the southern United States and later they went overseas.
By the time Lindsay leaves office, the city loses about 600,000 jobs. That's an astounding number if you think about it.
The city had two seemingly contradictory problems of housing prices that were still too expensive for most people to afford, but yet mass-scale abandonment of housing in the South Bronx, in Harlem, in Bushwick.
It was a combination of a fiscal crisis where the city started using capital money to fill operating gaps, which is not sustainable. It was a combination of some social unrest, which led to difficult situations in low-income neighborhoods, and many multifamily rental housing owners couldn't make a go of it anymore. And it was a wave of abandonment of rental housing, and the city, through foreclosure, ended up owning all these buildings.
The city laid off roughly 25% of its police force. So you had this incredible surge in crime. You're doing layoffs because you can't afford to keep the cops on the payroll anymore.
So that was a big problem. And then, of course, in the schools, race became the big issue and, led to the flight of many students from the school system.
There was no single teachers union in New York City. They were split into many disparate groups and they had no power. By 1968, when we started seeing teacher strikes, well over 95% of the teachers were unionized in the United Federation of Teachers, and their first fight was to fight back against the notion of giving the communities control of the schools. They wanted to protect their teachers. This led to politically a split between the black community and the teachers union.
All we want is a decent education for our kids and our kids in school. That's all we want. We're not here for any trouble.
With all this distrust, everyone who could was working politically to protect their own interests.
Why don't you read the sign for us?
Lesson for today. See John. John is the mayor. See John run. See John run Fun City. Isn't this fun? See John run the police. See John run the train. See John run the schools. See John run for mayor again. See John run out of town.
Thank you.
A lot of people looked at what was going on and said, the city can't be saved. It's going up in flames with crime. The kids aren't learning. The schools are crumbling.
Consolidated Edison in asking the full cooperation of New York citizens in reducing their consumption of power.
We called him up and he says, conserve all the lights you could. What can I conserve? I have no lights at all.
It was a great sense that the city cannot work. It can't be governed. It can't function without all of this inner turmoil.
The battle for the cities will go on. Across this nation, the struggle continues for rational urban priorities. And whatever my future, I will always give my voice and my strength to that fight.
When Lindsay's on, he set up the circumstances for the New York City financial crisis, which will last for a decade.
In 1970, the school system in New York City was reorganized. The Central Board of Education was comprised of 7 members. The mayor appointed 2 of those members, and each of the 5 borough presidents appointed a member of the Central Board of Education. So that meant that for the mayor to get anything done at the school system, he or she had to convince 3 borough presidents to get their appointees to go along with him. And they represented various interest groups. Some represented the teachers union, some represented the custodians union. Nobody was standing up for the children. The children came last.
As the city started to slip into decay, there were a number of great society liberals who believed in what they were doing, but they realized it wasn't working. And rather than just saying, well, I'm doing the best I can, they decided to try a different kind of business model.
Cy Flegel was that rarest of commodities. He was an actual reformer in a city of educators who claimed to be reformers but were disinformers. And Cy's idea was to offer kids in his district, one of the poorest in the city, a choice to learn things in fields that they were interested in, from science and mathematics to the arts to sports.
Being in East Harlem, there were no high schools.
the kids go to. And we had Benjamin Franklin, the worst high school in the city of New York. Benjamin Franklin graduated 7% of the kids who went into the school.
There was tremendous cuts in funding to the school system in the mid-1970s. Over 100 schools were closed. The school day was chopped down by one period a day. That's when a lot of the arts and music programs got taken out of the schools. We met with the chancellor and we said, we want to take over Benjamin Franklin and we want it closed and we want to create a new high school. And he agreed. This district broke up its middle schools into smaller schools, so you would have like 4 schools within a building. Each school had a particular theme, and students had to choose to go to these schools. They were beautiful schools for some kids. We opened the school, and we put Koch in as the principal. Now, Koch was the kind of guy who loved the most difficult kids. So he would let anyone into the school. All the principal had to do was say, take this kid, he would take him in. In the 70s, the consensus view was that schools didn't make a difference. So you did not talk about good schools and bad schools. You talked about good kids and bad kids, good students and bad students, or good families and bad families. And so that was an impediment to doing anything. 4 years later, every kid graduated. Every kid went to college. That was a big boost for the concept of creating small schools. So each year, people would come to us with their tales, you know. One guy wanted a sports school, another one wanted a science school, all kinds of schools. We kept expanding until there was 26 alternative schools, all doing well. There were 1 or 2 that didn't do well. We either closed them or changed them into a different kind of school.
The fact was they had no authority to do any of this. They just did it. That was the strength of the city's apathy. There was no money and no interest in what they were doing, which allowed them to experiment to the hilt.
When you met someone like Cy Flegel, it was like taking a really powerful, wonderful drug. And there were other people like that in other fields that were beginning to show their independence at that point and beginning to think anew.
Behind the famous Manhattan skyline, New York is a mess. $13 billion in debt, bankrupt in all but name, the city that was once the envy of the world is falling to pieces. 300,000 people are out of work, the streets are uncleaned, and the slum tenements breed violence almost as a way of life. 4 people are murdered here every day. There's a violent crime every 4 minutes.
I do not exaggerate when I say that New York is unique in the history of humankind. New York is not a problem. New York is a stroke of genius. How am I doing? Thank you.
I think Ed Koch's first term was one of the great terms in mayoral history, in that he gave the city back its spirit.
There was a young generation of baby boomers. Believe it or not, at one point we baby boomers were young, and we were coming back to settle in the city because we didn't want to live the suburban life that our parents had led.
The city looked sort of run down and had, garbage in the street, but the 80s were a boom. I mean, the nightclub scene, the restaurant scene here were huge. People went out every single night back in the 80s. On Monday nights, people would go out at 11 o'clock at night. It's never been more alive since probably the 40s or 50s.
Okay, girls, very simple. Rolling? What is the best thing in New York?
Everything is open all night. That's the best thing. Yeah, everything's open all night, 24 hours a day.
And what is the worst thing about New York?
You can get mugged going home. After being out for 24 hours a day, you'll be mugged.
I want to say this. I've alienated, I'm sure, a lot of people, and I've gotten the support of a lot of people.
He was the first Democratic mayor who was willing to say this is really screwed up. As he used to say, I am a sane liberal. And I think he understood that the policies of the last 10 years were insane.
Drawing on what he thought was Lindsay's failures, Ed Koch knew that New York could not continue to spend the way it had. So one of the things he did was really to tighten control over spending and take control of the budget department and every agency and make the agencies justify any increase in spending. It made a big difference. It gave the city a sense of confidence.
The city comes out of the fiscal crisis under Koch, but a lot of this has to do with the revival of Wall Street, which carries the city with it.
Ed Koch ran for governor in 1982, right after he was re-elected mayor in '81. Running for governor, I think, was an important moment in his mayoralty because it severed the relationship that he had with New York. There was a sense that he was born to be mayor. When he basically said, "I'm running for governor," a lot of people felt jilted. The love that the city had for him was never quite the same as it was in that first term.
My parents dropped me off in the city. Then a couple of weeks later, they said, "So what are you thinking of living in the city?" So I said, "Well, it's horribly gray, and there's concrete everywhere, and I can't get used to the fact that buildings hit the street. Then there's 9 or 10 feet of ugly sidewalk, and there are no plantings. There's nothing green here." I was there for 2.5 years. During that time, I became the chairman of Midtown Community Board number 5, which had to do with zoning. Bryant Park, it's at 42nd Street and 5th to 6th Avenue, so it's exactly at the heart of Midtown. It's the only green space there. So we had muggers, and every entrance to the park had a different drug market run by a different person. I was chosen by the Rockefellers to fix this mess. It was very difficult to take the space back from the criminals and the drug sellers. I got mugged here myself in my second month of work, and it felt dangerous. Nobody knew why I took the job. Parks, if they have graffiti and they smell like urine and they have feces all over and you see broken lights and broken fences and overgrown hedges, people quickly get the idea they can do whatever they want there who are lawbreakers.
What you feel is that your public spaces aren't really yours, that you know where to walk and where not to walk, who to look at, not to look at. And, you know, the going rule in the 1980s was you did not walk into Bryant Park in broad daylight unless, you know, you were trying to score some drugs. And that was just the rule, that was not part of your New York City. And there were whole sections of the city that felt like that, including, you know, in Midtown Manhattan. So Bryant Park was privatized, which led to a radical redesign of what transpired in the park and gave citizens a sense that they were safe and that this park was now theirs.
By putting activity in the park, sweeping up the litter, removing the graffiti, repairing a few things we had the money to repair, we ended up with a crime rate that went down in the 80s, even before the great crime rate reductions that we were part of later. The area near Grand Central is terrible. There were 600 homeless people unserved in and outside the terminal. Litter that was ankle deep by the end of the day, graffiti everywhere, dark streets. Koch people gave the okay to set up on a much larger basis than had existed before, a business improvement district. Covered 50 blocks or so.
The Business Improvement District is a specially chartered organization by the city, which allows the businesses in that community to tax themselves and then have total discretion over the way those funds are used.
Allowed us to privately provide all the things the city wasn't doing. Litter pickup all day long so the streets were clean, removing the graffiti right away. I did that one first, and then the 34th Street owners got envious, and some of them were the same people, and they said, "You ought to come down and clean up our mess." And the mess there was near Penn Station, where tourists and shoppers went, near Macy's Empire State Building, and very much the same techniques as with Bryant Park and Grand Central. It needed an alternative idea, and the success of it is shown by the fact that 34th Street and others have been modeled after by, now we've got 76 of them in New York City.
In 1986, Mayor Koch announced $5.4 billion, an unprecedented amount for any local government over 10 years, to renovate or build 252,000 units of housing. And he was responding to what was the extraordinary extent of the abandonment in these neighborhoods. And every mayor since Koch through today has really continued the arc of what Mayor Koch started. It was focusing on renovating abandoned city-owned housing and financing more affordable housing to create units.
Growing up, you saw graffiti, you saw a lot of the drugs, you saw like this level of dinginess, but then it was New York, right? I mean, we were all used to it. That was a way of life. And then when you thought that it could not get any worse, crack came.
This has reached epidemic proportions.
It is a crack epidemic, which police say is causing an increase in murder and other violent crime.
It took a nosedive. You saw individuals transform into zombies.
I believe they should impose the death penalty as an option to judge and jury, and I believe they should use it.
Mayor Koch is asking the federal government for help in this war against drug and a federal death penalty for drug dealers.
People were very angry and very upset about crime. And throughout the Koch years, several high-profile crimes shook the city. In 1984, you had the Bernard Goetz incident. Sort of a mild-mannered looking radio repairman shot 4 guys on the subway because he said they were threatening him. The city basically flocked to his defense. He was found not guilty of attempted murder and just found guilty of carrying an illegal handgun.
And people were like, wow, they felt sorry for him. And when they heard his story that he was previously robbed, people were fed up.
People have to take the law into their hands. I think he did the right thing.
I think he was right. People just getting fed up being ripped off like that.
If he was being robbed, hey, he had to do what he had to do. Self-defense.
A woman jogging in New York Central Park last Wednesday night, raped and nearly beaten to death.
In 1989, the Central Park jogger attack occurred. The story was a group of youths were rampaging through Central Park and beating people up. One woman, a jogger, was attacked. She was raped. This woman was beaten and left for dead. At the time, it horrified people.
To understand is to forgive. I don't want to understand what motivates someone to engage in this kind of horror. I want, rather than to understand him, I want him punished.
Race was always in the shadow of Ed Koch's mayoralty. He used phrases like poverty pimps and poverticians that many in the black community felt were stigmatizing. And so he always had a tenuous relationship with black New Yorkers.
There was a misapprehension of what the black community actually wanted. Black politicians at that point represented the anger of their constituents, which was legitimate anger. Racism surely existed, but they didn't also represent the interests of their constituents. Part of the tension was generated by Ed Koch because he wasn't going to kowtow to black extremists.
Koch was willing to speak out, but the more he spoke out, the more racial tension and friction that he created. And so therefore, at the end of his term, people had kind of had it with the combative Koch mode of governing.
He's the most annoying person. Oh, yeah. No, good answer. Right on, good answer. Survey says Ed Koch, the most annoying person in New York, absolutely. See the cover of New York Magazine? Great cover.
Okay, well, make a face like Ed Koch.
No, he doesn't.
Or just make a funny face.
It's that grin with no hair, you know what I mean? It's that whole thing with no hair and the whole grin, that kind of shit-eating, I can't say that here. What's his cable? Sure you can.
Why not?
Shit-eating grin, it's like all that, yeah, I'm gonna rob you blind. I'm gonna kick you out of this city and kick you out of your apartments. I'm gonna kill you.
So you go forward to the end of the 80s, the early 90s, budget stabilized, jobs somewhat stabilized, but still, what do you do about this severe violent crime problem that no one had been able to address in 2 decades?
There are people who think I'm acerbic and sarcastic and too New Yorkish. I'm proud to be New Yorkish.
Ed Koch ran for a 4th term, but he lost.
Rudolph Giuliani, who lives with an 18-hour working day, a 6-day working week, and now several death threats in his in-tray.
Rudy Giuliani was one of the great federal prosecutors who does a great deal to bring down the mafia.
It is very, very important that there be a general rule, and one that is well known in this country, that if you violate the law, whether it's insider trading or tax evasion or fraud or bribery, a so-called white-collar crime, the overwhelming general rule is that you go to prison.
Rudy Giuliani had made a big name for himself prosecuting white-collar criminals in the 80s with all of the stock manipulations and so forth. He famously went into the trading floor of major houses and had people arrested, and perp walked out. You know, he had a real flair for publicity.
When I decided for the first time to run for mayor, almost unanimously, my friends told me I was crazy. I didn't get to run against Koch. Dinkins beat him, changed the whole nature of the race because now I was running against the first African-American nomination of the Democrat Party.
But Giuliani is just not a very effective politician, retailer, wholesaler, or anyway. As for my own vote that year, I couldn't vote for Dinkins, but I didn't know if I wanted to vote for Giuliani. For all his talents, he's enormously talented, enormously intelligent. He's a terrible politician. It seemed like he was running for sheriff. He hadn't mastered the issues involved in governing New York.
We lost by 2%. Of course, I was sad losing. I remember Senator All-Inspector said, you should look at this race as you have money in the bank. And the question is how you're going to spend it. And I recommend not spending it running for mayor again because it's impossible. Republicans just can't get elected.
My father remembers when he was young, talking with neighbors who themselves remembered the days of slavery. Tonight, we forge a new link in that chain of memory.
David Dinkins was a real gentleman and played by the rules as far as conventional politics go. But he really had no understanding of the forces that were going on inside the city at that time.
David Dinkins was known for his tennis playing. He came out of the Harlem political machine.
He was elected with high expectations from the public. They wanted David to do something about racial tensions in the city, which were very high, have always been high, continue to be high. They wanted to do something about the rising crime and disorder. The city was still having a hard time.
David Dinkins, I think, gets a bad rap. He was not a very effective mayor. And almost immediately after David Dinkins was sworn in as mayor, he was confronted with a series of racial incidents, starting with the Red Apple boycott.
On Church Avenue, there was a Korean fruit stand, a place that I had shopped in a whole number of times. Sonny Carson, who was a less glib version of Al Sharpton, took advantage of a situation in which an African-American woman got into a fight with the Korean greengrocers. Sonny Carson had been shaking down businesses. He tries to create a boycott of the Red Apple. Outside, Carson's people are shouting racist slogans. The city is in an uproar. Dinkins refuses to intervene and bring this nonsense to a halt. Eventually, Dinkins intervenes, but the sense of an incompetent who will dawdle, who's unable to act on behalf of racial tolerance, sticks with Dinkins. To be fair to Dinkins, he's a product of the old Board of Estimate.
The fight had gone on to abolish the Board of Estimate and to replace it with a separation of powers system of government. And that was really the brainchild of Peter Vallone.
The big thing was that I was elected speaker by the overwhelming plurality of one vote. So as you can see, I was very popular at the time. I got elected in 1974, and I said, there's something wrong with the city. There's nobody in charge. It's only borough presidents that are running the city.
The way it worked was each borough president got one vote. The mayor, the comptroller, and the then city council president, because they were elected citywide, they each got 2 votes. So a total of 11, and it was always a scramble to assemble a majority. And it was really the super legislature. It rendered the city council pretty unimportant.
8 executives running the city. They only care about their boroughs. They don't care about police citywide. They care about police in their borough. They don't care sanitation citywide. They don't care about anything citywide as long as they had their borough working.
So there was a lot of deal making. If the city council president wanted to fight with the mayor, then the mayor would have to go and try to get the Board of Estimate vote from the borough president in Staten Island and Queens, or try to make a coalition that way.
This is crazy. You have to do something citywide. You need police citywide, you need sanitation citywide, you need everything citywide. The suit was finally brought before the United States Supreme Court, saying it's unconstitutional because how could small Staten Island with 300,000 votes have the same vote as Brooklyn with 2.5 million votes?
Under the constitutional principle of one man, one vote, it was thrown out as unconstitutional, and a lot of the power went to the city council.
Peter led the charge to bring the city council into the modern age. As a result of that, city council got the full legislative power of the city to make the laws, the power of the purse to do the budget, the power to do land use, which the council had never had before.
Conversely, it also gave the mayor more power because he didn't have to make these deals with the borough presidents.
To eliminate the Board of Estimate was the beginning of the liberation of the mayoralty and the beginning of the city's return to effectiveness as a governmental structure.
Dinkins didn't know what to do with it. He was a creature of the Board of Estimate. He grew up under the Board of Estimate, and he didn't do much with it.
In 1989, I was approached by George Kelling, co-author of the Broken Windows article with James Wilson, who were consulting with the Transit Authority here in New York. They asked if I might want to consider becoming chief of the transit police in New York City. New York City at that time had 3 police departments: transit police, housing police, and the city police. They looked the same, but they were different departments at that time. So I came, April of 1990, I was appointed chief of the transit police.
We had 26 murders on the subways in 1990. That had remained pretty consistent for a decade. And the Times would say, you're pretty safe as long as you're not walking through some of the long passageways in Manhattan, as long as you're sitting in the middle car. This is as good as it's going to get.
The subway, like taking a walk down into Dante's Inferno. The smell, filth, a lot of the turnstiles were disabled. Aggressive begging, people coming on to the train everywhere. And they actually had cardboard cities on the end of the platforms.
Bratton pioneered this idea that if we address small crimes in the subway system, we can prevent bigger crimes in the subway system. So they started looking at who was jumping over the turnstiles and who was beating the fare, and found out that a disproportionate number were also wanted for violent crimes, or they were carrying guns or knives into the subway system. So if you apprehend people beating the fare, you can prevent violent robberies and murders in the subway system. And within just months of this, the Times was saying, okay, crime is down by double digits.
And it worked. In the space of less than 2 years that I was here as transit police, crime went down by a very significant amount.
On Labor Day weekend, 1990, a young fellow by the name of Brian Watkins, with his family, had come from Utah. They were waiting to take a train, and a bunch of thugs cut the father's pants, they took his wallet out, kicked the mother when she tried to stop them. Young Brian Watkins and his brother thought to fight these guys off, but of course they had a knife, and they stabbed poor Brian Watkins in the heart. And even though he was stabbed, he tried to chase these guys until he died on the steps.
Monday morning, after Watkins is stabbed to death, I come in and I've said, Peter, we're going to lose the city. We have to do something about it. He says, what do you think we should do? I said, we have to increase the strength of the police department, not just what you call head count, but patrol strength as well, actually on the city to restore the reality and the perception of public safety. If we don't do that, we're going to lose the city. Peter said, how do we do that? What we're going to do is we're going to have a piece of legislation having a mandatory minimum number of cops by 6,000. And Peter said, can I force the mayor and the police commissioner to do these hires? I said, you can't do it without a referendum. If we do the referendum, we'll win, because public sentiment is for safe streets. People are scared to death.
The City Council in New York is a relatively new institution in the way it's formed now, with the City Council Speaker. And the Brian Watkins murder was one of the first major challenges confronting the City Council in the post-Board of Estimate era. With their new powers, they were able to work directly with the mayor to pass crime legislation.
I said, Mayor Dinkins, there's no longer a Board of Estimate. You just have to talk to us, the City Council. We want to pass a law. And after a great amount of difficulty, with every single legislature, we got the cops within 2 years.
The name of the program that was evolved from these discussions was Safe Streets, Safe City. It was a Peter Vallone initiative. We needed the support of the City Council members. We got it. We needed the support of the legislative leaders up in Albany Assembly and the State Senate. We got it. We need the governor's support. We got it. And the program started in the beginning of 1991. Quite candidly, Mayor Dinkins was not enamored with the idea that we were forcing him to hire more police. His comment to me is, what are you doing to me?
Advisors to Mayor Dinkins never really got into this idea. This was not his core constituency, they felt. He had to do more social things, and he's using up this money. So they backloaded the hires, I think, in a belief that if Dinkins was reelected, he wouldn't have to carry through on his plan. It came back to backfire on them because crime was still up. The largest class in the police academy that I can recall, 2,800 police officers were hired in August of 1993. So guess what? They graduated in January of 94 with Mayor Giuliani's arm around them. So he got all the credit for the 2,800 cops. Instead of moving those hires, let's say 6-8 months earlier, Mayor Dinkins could have gotten some credit for that, but of course he didn't.
The major event of the David Dinkins years that's really stuck out for everybody is the Crown Heights riots. Now, Crown Heights is an area in central Brooklyn inhabited by a lot of African Americans, and also it's the center of the Lubavitch Hasidic community. The leader of that community would regularly have motorcades that would drive through the city, and people sort of took offense to the way in which they would sometimes speed. One day, a member of the motorcade supposedly was speeding through a red light, lost control, and jumped the curb and hit a little 5-year-old boy and pinned him against a building, and he died.
It's angry and ugly, and it's dangerous. An Hasidic man hit by a brick on Eastern Parkway. A cop assigned today to protect the mayor suffers a fractured leg. People who observed the attack taunting him as he's wheeled to an ambulance.
You reap what you sow. What goes around comes around.
What erupted was the worst anti-Semitic violence in American history. It went on for 3 days.
Whole areas of Jewish neighborhoods were burned and stores burnt out. And the police were not terribly aggressive in intervening into those problems.
Because passions are running so high, there is no way the community can yet come together. The mayor today sought to diffuse the tension by talking to young people, and he took some heat.
I myself personally worked hard on your campaign, and I'm right now I don't know what to say. All right, I'm like real sorry that I did it.
I have been here, and I'm surprised that not one of you would say, oh, but he's been here. I'm surprised that not one of you. You ought to know it, and it's unfair for you to get on the media and say, the mayor ought to come here.
Meanwhile, the Reverend Al Sharpton and Alton Maddox are demanding the arrest of the Hasidic driver. They say if he's not arrested, they will hunt him down themselves.
In a day and night of screaming sirens so far, 35 people have been injured, 17 of them police officers, and we've just learned in the last 45 minutes that 2 cops were shot on Schenectady Avenue, not badly hurt, taken to Kings County Hospital, and within of the last 2 hours, 1 person was killed.
Culminated with the murder of an Australian rabbinical student who was visiting, who was stabbed to death.
I was asked to come in on the 3rd day. I put in the tactics and strategies that brought it under control.
Mayor Dinkins received a lot of criticism for not stopping the violence. His idea was to let the people let off some steam.
The assumption of the Dinkins years was that the police are only reactive, and if they are proactive, that will be necessarily racist. So it's best to just let the anarchy flow, and then we'll hope we can come in after the fact. Well, of course, that is a specious assumption, because every time that you let anarchy loose without trying to pull it back, you're sending the message that no one is in control, and it is very hard to reverse course.
Dinkins couldn't care less. He knew what he knew, and he knew that crime was a function of underlying social conditions. The idea that policing could have an effect on crime was simply alien to him.
That's when the people of the city lost confidence that David Dinkins could bridge these racial divisions and lead the city forward.
In the early 90s, I was at a meeting of people who wanted to reform New York. And in the course of the discussion, what came up, a guy named Bill Clinton, who I never heard of, was going to be giving a speech on welfare reform. Would I be interested in coming? I said, sure.
We basically believe that we require a partnership between government and the private sector and the education sector, and that we shouldn't be giving out rights to people without requiring them to assume certain responsibilities.
I'm just absolutely stunned. He's brilliant. He gets everything right. Who is this guy? I came home, I told my wife, this guy's going to be president of the United States.
There were a group of us who saw Bill Clinton coming, and I guess you'd call us moderate Democrats, new Democrats, whatever. And I think a lot of us saw that there had to be changes in the way government worked. It seemed that Bill Clinton was someone who understood that we had to break through the paralysis that excessive union rules and industrial age bureaucracy had caused. And Bill Clinton ran against the activist base of the Democratic Party on all of those issues. People were ready for an enlightened, moderate, liberal form of government.
The early 90s was an exciting period because people are fed up with the failure, both on the federal level and on the local level. People are open-minded, they're willing to talk to each other across the aisle. And so it was an air of practicality to the discussions. Began to think, well, maybe there's some possibilities for New York.
There were problems that began to happen when the industrial age ended, blue-collar jobs left, and the information age began. And the Manhattan Institute was one of the first places that began looking in an academic way at problems like addiction, education, crime, family structure. These were things that needed to be looked at.
The number one issue was unquestionably the crime and disorder crisis in the city. And so that attracted people who wouldn't necessarily be considered conservatives, like George Kelling, the criminologist, Fred Siegel himself.
I considered myself ex-left, and I thought that the Democratic Party had moved very significantly to the left. In fact, I remember that being part of a Manhattan Institute roundtable with Fred Siegel and Elaine Kamarck from the Progressive Policy Institute. And we were talking about how difficult it was to reduce welfare rolls. And Elaine just said, What we're talking about here is that there are a whole bunch of social workers who are afraid they're going to lose their jobs. And it was simple truths like that that made the Manhattan Institute a place where truth, not ideology, dwelled.
We tried bigger government, and it didn't work. With so much money flushing around the system, people had no incentive to change. At the same time, cities in particular, as political entities, need resources. So it wasn't a question of cutting back on resources as well. We knew it was just a question of getting the incentives right for people to do what they were supposed to do in the first place. In the 1990s, what we wanted to do was see if we could apply those ideas to affect change in our own hometown. The City Journal was the vehicle through which we thought we would talk about public policy in New York City. So we thought a magazine that applied our principles to urban questions would be the most effective way to go. The collection of people that actually was the brain trust of the Manhattan Institute were all ex-Great Society liberals who realized it didn't work, and City Journal provided the only forum for them to report on why it didn't work. The great thing about the people that we brought in was that they weren't theoreticians, they were practitioners. So they did excellent journalism in telling people how things really worked. So the City Journal was launched in 1990, right at the beginning of the decade.
It was time for reformers to react against liberalism.
David Dinkins wants to be re-elected as the first black mayor of the city he calls the Gorgeous Mosaic. Rudolph Giuliani is the tough lawyer who sees a city on the verge of collapse.
Well, the major advantage that Giuliani had when he ran for election in 1993 for the second time was that the city had experienced 4 years of David Dinkins.
You know, the difference between the first campaign and the second was Giuliani ran on his record as district attorney, but that really didn't give him a kind of operating philosophy of government.
I knew crime. I didn't know the budget. I didn't know the environment. I didn't know welfare. I didn't know transportation. I didn't know procurement. I didn't know, boy, what I didn't know. So I said, now we're going to do it differently. I did a 18-month seminar in which I called experts in to teach me. The first one was Andrew Cuomo. He gave us a 2.5-hour lecture on the housing problem. Several people from the Clinton administration, people from the former Bush administration came and helped us. Henry Kissinger came and gave us a lecture. And then what we would do after the lecture, we would get together and we'd play a game, which is, if we were in charge, what would we do? And then we'd write it out. This is what we would do.
We would start meeting with our scholars and come to our events and participate in our conferences. The story is that he had an aide who saw a copy of City Journal in a bookstore and said, oh, Rudy's got to actually read this, which he brought to him. And that was how the first meeting was set up. And he really taught himself in those 4 years, you know, what are the underlying problems and what are some possible solutions? And I think he articulated that in the second campaign, which allowed people to see a way out.
He narrowly beats Dinkins. And the reason he beats Dinkins is because Staten Island wants to secede.
City Council was made more of a traditional legislature, and the Board of Estimate was abolished, and they lost power on the City Council due to proportional representation, which assigned Staten Island only 3 of 51 seats. Facing being the city's garbage dump, new fees on the ferry, and just feeling marginalized, they voted to become independent. Giuliani promised to acknowledge Staten Island's concerns, and high turnout led Giuliani to win the election by only 3,500 votes.
Giuliani comes into office, and the talk is he can't last. The powers that be in New York will get rid of him.
I get elected. The advantage we had is we had a game plan for everything. Doesn't mean it was the right game plan. A lot of them had to be readjusted when you got to the reality of what you could do and couldn't do.
Rudy Giuliani runs up against the idea that New York is ungovernable. He knows vastly more than he knew in '89. He's ready to govern, and he's ready to take on the city's vested interests.
My campaign chairman, Arnie Burns, said to me, Do it as a one-term mayor. Say, I'm going to do everything I want, everything I believe is necessary, no matter how unpopular it is. And if it works out, wonderful, I'll get a second term. If it doesn't, I can always live with myself. So that's what I did.
The Democratic Party was controlled or influenced by all of these other groups. So they didn't have as much swinging room as Rudy did. Rudy had no inherent allegiances. He was just going to win or lose based on his performance.
The Speaker of the City Council was Peter Vallone. My first day in City Hall, I said, Beth, give me the Speaker's number. That I have a couple of bagels and coffee. I'd like to come over and see him. I haven't had breakfast yet. And she says, well, do you want him to come over to you? I said, no, I don't want him to come over. I want to come over there. I walk in, I say hello to Peter, I sit down, and he says, do you know this is the first time the mayor's ever been in this office? I had 2 Democrat mayors, Koch and Dinkins, never came in here. I said, I know how religious a Catholic you are, so you have to be in this because you want to help people. I think we can sit down, we can put aside the political stuff just between the two of us, we can figure out what we can agree on, and we can implement it. If we can't compromise it, we'll debate it. But I bet if we do that, we can do a lot.
Peter was introducing him not only to the members of the council, but to the staffs of the various agencies and departments, to the political leadership of the parties, to the community groups, to the trade associations, to the lobbyists, to the unions. We broadened Rudy's horizons. And Mayor Giuliani, to his credit, was ready, willing, and able to have those conversations, to meet with these people, and to partner up when he could. And Peter was instrumental in that.
He saw that I want to work with him. I don't want to work against him. And if we're going to make this work, Rudy, we'll work together. And that's what we did.
They put literally red phones on their desks. And the only one who could answer the phone on the mayor's side was the mayor. And the only one who could answer in the speaker's office was the speaker. And they were constantly talking and meeting.
We met almost every Thursday. He'd have a list, I'd have a list of the things that we thought we needed. And we would begin by matching the list, and where we overlapped, we get it done. Where we didn't, we try to work it out.
And we were always looking to build consensus if we could. That's not to say we didn't have political fights and litigation fights. In fact, Rudy interviewed me for a judgeship. And he said, Richard, he said, tell me about your litigation experience. I said, Mr. Mayor, other than the 20 cases I had against you? And he laughed. But that was the kind of relationship we had.
The Clinton era was marked by a recognition in a way that we hadn't seen really since the 1920s, that the business of America is business. Essentially, the idea that Wall Street was it. The opening to China, the huge tech boom, all of that happened under Clinton. And New York City profited handsomely from this approach. And Giuliani was both a beneficiary and a player. Now, it may seem like these are very different political figures. However, there is a kind of similarity in the sense of, I guess what you'd call like, the neoliberal consensus. This idea that we can't go forward in the same way.
Clinton was quite vocal about the crime problem and proponents of welfare reform. So those were 2 key areas right there where there was overlap with what Giuliani was trying to do in New York.
During the past 9 months, we have moved quickly and steadily to implement the toughest, smartest crime bill in American history.
Bill Clinton passes in '94 the crime bill. Giuliani not only helps lobby for it, he goes across the country to help sell it. So you have the Republican prosecuting crime-fighting mayor in New York working with the Democratic baby boomer president to sell an anti-crime initiative across the country. Those are the sorts of things that were happening because crime was so big.
New York is in the middle of its worst recession for 50 years, but the economy isn't the key issue here. Nor is it homelessness, AIDS, drugs, or the state of the roads. None of them compare with the one issue today that obsesses New Yorkers: crime.
Giuliani begins a search for police commissioner And he made it clear that he would be potentially interested in naming me as commissioner based on my success in the subway system, and that I would be his choice for police commissioner effective January of 1994. What Rudy and I both shared was a belief that the city could be made safer, be made better. To take back the streets of New York, in some respects, was like taking Europe back from the Nazis, that it was going to require an all-out assault.
One of the early priorities he had was to create a larger police department by merging the 3 police departments that existed in New York.
We acquired the housing police. We acquired the transit police because they're chasing the same criminal. The guy may do 2 muggings in the subway and 3 muggings on Times Square. So the transit police are looking for the same guy that NYPD is looking for, and they don't talk to each other. By doing that, we went up to a 41,000-person police department.
Bill Bratton embarked on this famous experiment in policing called broken windows policing.
George Kelling and James Q. Wilson came up with the theory of broken windows in 1984, saying if you have a window that is broken and it is not fixed, then you will have 2 broken windows, then you'll have 3 broken windows. At some point, you have a neighborhood that is very, very, very hard to recover.
But modern policing did not begin with capturing criminals. It began with maintaining order. And Bratton was very much attuned to this.
Quality of life offenses are as important as serious crime to be addressed. The basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder, the 5 most important words in law enforcement. To deal effectively with crime, you're also going to have to simultaneously deal with disorder.
A healthy neighborhood polices itself in the sense that if you've got a neighborhood with healthy foot traffic, where everyone is employed, where every restaurant and retail space is full, if someone comes along and they break a window, that window will be immediately fixed. It's only when the neighborhood has stopped being healthy that it is not immediately fixed. So once you have gotten to the point where the police are in charge of this, you are already at a point of failure.
In the 70s and 80s, police moved away from dealing with disorder on the streets and instead focused on responding to crime. And we didn't deal with quality of life crime at all.
The way policing had worked had been getting police off the streets and into police cars, answering radio calls for serious crimes, rapes, murders, bank robbers.
And I'd go to community meetings and armed to the teeth with all my crime statistics, where it was happening, who was doing it. And people in the neighborhoods didn't want to talk about that. They want to talk about the prostitute in their doorway. They wanted to talk about the abandoned car that was never towed away, about the graffiti, about the gang drinking on the corner. People were as concerned, or maybe more concerned, by what they were seeing every day versus the crime that they would read about, but most of them were not personally experiencing. What was basically creating the fear was a phenomenal amount of disorder. The presidential commissions, a number of the other commissions that had studied all the violence, the race violence, felt that the role of police was to respond to crime while society figured out what to do about what they thought were the real causes of crime: poverty, racism, unemployment. My belief was the cause of crime is people. And by focusing on the small things, oftentimes we disrupted bigger things from happening. We started to focus on stopping and arresting fear evaders. What did we find? 1 out of 7 were wanted on warrants for other offenses. 1 out of every 20, 21 were carrying a weapon, box cutters on up to Uzi machine guns. So by going after quality of life, we're also having an impact on crime.
Criminals do not specialize. Criminals are omnivorous. They are multitaskers. They break one law, they break another law. There's a great chain of being in criminality between the low level and the high level. It is all connected. And even if it wasn't, even if Fair Beavers did nothing worse, it still would be essential to stop it because it sends the message that no one is in control.
These guys from Brooklyn that wanted to go to Manhattan and rob, they wouldn't pay the fare, they'd hop the turnstile, and they're bringing the tools of their trade with them, the illegal firearm. You stop, you capture that person, and you're saving a shooting, who knows how many robberies, how many lives are being saved. And we saw that. Those numbers came down dramatically. Violent crime, way down.
Giuliani in the first year really left me alone in many respects. Made it quite clear his goal was crime and disorder. He got it. He really understood the importance of the look of things. So one of the things he did right off the bat with his sanitation commissioner was clean up all the sanitation trucks. He basically had them all repainted and they were clean again, and he kept them clean. You know, he was very focused on little things. He had his vision, he had his goals, he had his strategies, but he was also very focused on the tactics.
He goes after the squeegee men. They were as annoying as hell and in many ways threatening. People felt like there was nothing you could do about it, that it was really quite hopeless. They seemed to be everywhere. And so Rudy told Bill Bratton to make this the priority, is to get these squeegee men off the street and in jail if that needs to be the case. And lo and behold, they found out there weren't that many squeegee men. There were maybe about 75 of these guys making life a living hell. But it was one of those very visible things that people noticed.
Another thing we did is adopt a highway program that allowed companies basically to adopt parts of a highway and pay for additional cleanup services. We wanted to make sure the entrances to the city were clean. It was a small thing to do, but again, it changed people's perception of coming into the city.
The department was not effective dealing significantly with crime. Uniformed officers were not authorized or allowed to make drug arrests. And so when the woman looking out a second floor window would call the drug dealers on the corner now and then see those uniformed cops drive by, what'd she assume? They're on the take.
So when Bratton came in, he said, you do what you have to do. You are now allowed to arrest people for narcotics.
Giuliani provided the authorization, as I had been authorized in the subway, to move forward in a sense. If we didn't get our arms around this problem, we were never going to make the city safer.
I had to clean up Times Square. In order to clean up Times Square, I got to get rid of the drug dealers, I got to get rid of the murderers, I got to get rid of the robbers. I knew how to do that. For example, we got rid of the muggers by putting cops on horseback so they could see into the crowd. We put undercover police officers in the crowd, called the anti-crime unit, but they dress like you and me or like the crowd. And we'd give them walkie-talkies, and the guy on the horseback would say, to your right, 20 steps, there's a pickpocket. See? Guys, I got it. Next pickpocketing, he'd grab. There's a purse snatcher. There's a harasser. There's a possible rapist, he's dragging a woman. Took about 3 or 4 months, crime was down like 50%. Then it went down 75%, and then it turned out to be no crime.
Giuliani had this real heavy focus on getting rid of the vice conditions in Times Square.
Giuliani essentially tore down a lot of the old shops, and he brought the Walt Disney Company in to build a store. You know, you go there and it's literally just families from the Midwest going to eat at Red Lobster.
There was a strong belief that Rudy had that you have to reclaim the public spaces in New York. It involves cleanliness, keeping crime under control, getting drug dealers off the corner. It means cleaning up graffiti.
2 a.m. in the 70s and the 80s, you couldn't walk through here, man. Sex, drugs.
And now?
It's wonderful. I think it's clean.
That's Giuliani.
Well, he did it.
Broken windows policing saw a pretty immediate improvement.
More black people are alive today because Rudy Giuliani was mayor. During the entire time of his tenure in office, shootings of black people continued to drop and drop and drop because the police weren't focused on looking for black people and throwing them into jail. They were looking at public disorder and trying to dissipate it before it evolved into something more serious.
The statistics can't tell you, however, is what's going on behind the scenes at the once infamous New York Police Department. It's a fundamental overhaul of the police force as an organization, and a complete rethink of how best to wage war on the criminal, because war and the philosophy of battle is very much part of the new corporate-style thinking.
In 1994, Jack Maple, who was my Deputy Commissioner for Crime Control Strategies, probably one of the most brilliant people I've ever known on dealing with crime issues, and Louis Anamone, who was chief of patrol, effectively created this system of accountability called Comstat, where they required every precinct to have crime maps and to track daily where crime was developing and to do something about it.
So Comstat means computer statistics, and all it is a recounting of each of the 7 major crimes in each of the precincts in the city on a daily basis, so we can get a good picture. How are you doing this week? How are you doing for the past month? And how are you doing year to date?
So Comstat has 4 basic components to it. Timely, accurate intelligence. Gather up your crime information every day. Rapidly respond to those patterns and trends, and precinct captain was expected to know about it, talk about it, and what he was doing about it. Effective tactics, where what you're doing about it, was it working? If not, why not?
So we're sitting in a room. I'm at one end with Jack Maple alongside me, some other chiefs on the other side, and we're discussing crime. Behind him or her was a map of the area that they were responsible for. And you'd see the red robbery dots. And then you'd ask, now put up the complaints about narcotic activity. You'd see some right around that area where the robbery dots were. And then you'd ask, what about our shooting incidents in this precinct? Put those up on the map. And lo and behold, they're also in that same little bit of an area of the precinct. So I would ask that person standing at the podium, tell me a little bit about what I see on that screen. Who's doing that? Why are they doing it? Why haven't we caught them? How many of different patterns do we have here? Are these robberies all individual guys, or are any of them linked? 10% of the locations in the city accounted for over 60% of the violence in the city. And that became clear early on as we're looking at the maps. Although you might have had 1,900 homicides the year before, there weren't 1,900 different shooters. We had 100,000 robberies. There weren't 100,000 different robbery perpetrators. There were some people doing a lot of the crime. Let's identify them and let's get them.
It was the idea, if you want to prevent crime, you can't wait till there's 30 or 40 incidents to identify, gee, we have a pattern, we have a problem. You needed to do it when it was 2, 3, or 4, to develop a system that you could effectively map out the city, where was crime occurring, and then when you saw those hot spots start to emerge, put cops on the dots.
This is very similar here, what we're doing, is to what the British did in World War II. The British invented radar. The radar told them where their opposition was coming from, so the RAF would be up there waiting for the opposition. Well, this is our radar system here. And as you see all those dots on the map, that's our opponents. So this way we can deploy rapidly, we can be focused, we can use effective tactics to knock down our opponents there.
You really think you're in a war, don't you?
This is a war.
For years, mayors ran for office saying they were going to clean up crime in the subway. When I became mayor, we used the Comstat program to figure out why hasn't it worked. The Comstat program gave us the answer. 75% of the crime is committed in those days on the platform. Only 25% in the cars. All the police were in the cars. We took the police out of the car. We put them on a platform where the crime was taking place. We allocated them exactly the way crime was allocated. 75% of the platform, 25% in the car. All of a sudden, crime went down within weeks by 50%. Within months, people were saying the subways are safe again. And when the criminals would move back, because we had the Comstat system, we were only 2 days behind them. The city never dealt with crime in a scientific way like this before, in an intelligent way like this before. Crime was crime, and who knew how to stop it?
Bratton and Giuliani came in and said, we are holding police commanders ruthlessly accountable for crime on their watch.
They weren't being held accountable for crime because it was believed that crime was beyond their power to control. They were being held accountable for response to crime.
If that police commander did not have the data at his fingertips and a plan to save lives, overwhelmingly black lives, his career was on the ropes.
The crooks seem to be taking Monday, Tuesday off, right? And they're working Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So we should therefore be working Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
This changed the atmosphere of the NYPD to a sense of urgency, and that has never left the department.
And the more computers got sophisticated, the more sophisticated we became. We could pin map it. We could measure it by time. We could see that auto theft took place in certain neighborhoods between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. So 10 at night, 2 in the morning, we were there. When it moved, we moved with them.
After the first year, the crime declines were so dramatic that the papers and the media reporting dramatic declines in crime. So people were seeing where they got the news, but in the reality in their streets, the prostitutes were gone. The squeegee pest was gone. The disorder was gone. Times Square was starting to get cleaned up. I predicted in a speech at the Manhattan Institute in 1996, after I left as police commissioner, over time, as we corrected behavior, there'd be less need for summonses, arrests, stop, question, and frisk. And I was proven right. The jail population went down dramatically. By the time I left after 29 months, crime was down 39%. I benefited from Giuliani being mayor because I don't think that Dinkins would have ever authorized me to be as assertive with many of the practices that we put into place. And Giuliani did.
And with the decline in crime, New York City began a rebound. More businesses that had been leaving started to stay, and the city started to come back in a way.
We've made a lot of changes in the city of New York. New York City's welfare rolls are down more in the last 6 or 7 months than probably has been the case in, I believe it's in 25 or 30 years.
When we came into office, I would say there was maybe 1.2 million people on welfare. And if you looked at the city's projections at the time, it was going to go up from 1.2 to 1.3 without a real plan about how you move people from welfare towards self-sufficiency.
At that time, Republicans believed that welfare recipients did not want to work, that they were basically bums. And on the left, you had people who basically believed people were not ready to work, that they needed all kinds of assistance. They had to be helped with their transportation and their education and their training and their housing and their whatever. All of a sudden, you had Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich talking to each other about how do we change welfare, as Clinton said, as we know it.
We have to end welfare as a way of life and make it a path to independence and dignity.
Bill Clinton knew more about welfare as it really applies in people's lives than any other president before him. And the fact is, if you look at the history of the negotiations on the 1996 welfare reform legislation, Bill Clinton took a very personal interest in it and could go toe-to-toe with any expert in the country on how these programs actually worked.
Era of big government is over.
Giuliani wants to pick up on what Clinton's talking about in terms of welfare reform. He wants to have people who are on welfare work.
The stars were in alignment. We had a welfare reform president in Bill Clinton, a welfare reform speaker of the House in Newt Gingrich. We had a welfare reform governor in George Pataki, and we had a welfare reform mayor in Rudy Giuliani.
I knew exactly what I was going to do, fingerprinting, workfare, and then I was going to change my welfare workers into employment agents.
People used to go to welfare centers to collect their welfare. We renamed all the welfare centers job centers. We also changed the way that the welfare centers functioned when they became job centers. You actually were given job opportunities.
A city agency like ours relies on outside contractors to provide certain kinds of specialized services. And one of those specialized services that was really essential to this job is the job placement service, helping people get into employment.
And luckily in New York, we had a program called America Works. And it was the coolest idea that I had ever heard.
America Works was the first for-profit company doing welfare to work in the United States. We were able to get welfare recipients jobs. We were able to get private companies to hire them. The country believed very strongly that education and training was the right way to move people from welfare to work. We didn't believe that.
What you need is job readiness, and that can be done in a matter of weeks. You have to be prompt and on time, you have to be reasonably dressed, you have to be courteous. You don't need a 6-month college course to prepare people for work.
The minute we started going right into the private sector, we were getting 65 to 70% of the people hired.
We had specific programs with employers. We had a program with Macy's, for instance, where Macy's would hire people from our welfare rolls.
There were work incentives for your housing, and there were incentives for your medical care. So there were a lot of things that incentivized going to work.
And so it changed people's perception of what welfare could be, a job opportunity, not a way of life. And America Works was crucial in changing that thinking.
Giuliani brought in Jason Turner, and Jason Turner had been in the Reagan administration. He worked for Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin. He basically took on the whole welfare industrial complex of the city.
There were 110 employment contractors when I arrived. When I left, there were 13. So we told them that they weren't going to get paid on the basis of political connections. They weren't going to get paid because they turned the lights on in the morning. They had to actually go out and find people jobs.
If they found you a job, they got a bonus. The better the job, the bigger the bonus. The longer the person stayed at the job, the longer you got the bonus. So what it meant was you didn't do it for like a 3-week job because you didn't get paid for a 3-week job. They had to remain for a certain period of time.
After the first full year that the contract's incentives were in place, the number of people who got jobs doubled citywide.
We used in cash assistance Jobstat, which was taken from the police department's use of Comstat, and we targeted and focused on neighborhoods and communities where the problem was most severe. Every month we went through statistics looking at which ones of our job centers were helping people get jobs and which ones of our job centers were not, and then we brought attention to the programs that were performing less well and to the people who ran those programs in those offices. And it was a way of holding people accountable at the management level to the performance in the neighborhoods and communities that they were responsible for. That led to bringing the kind of attention that Bedford-Stuyvesant or East New York or the really difficult neighborhoods in the city needed in order to come out of the problems they had been in.
Next thing I did is I required you to work if you were on welfare. There's a provision, little known, never used before, of New York law that allows you to require someone getting public assistance to work for a maximum of 18 hours a week. Because theoretically, you don't get welfare unless you're looking for work. If somebody's been collecting welfare and you can prove they don't go look for work, you can take it away from them. And the city can assign you to work for 18 hours. Never did it before. So I introduced workfare. It was very controversial. The New York Times said I was running a plantation.
When Giuliani starts imposing work requirements on welfare, he discovers something really interesting. There are people on welfare in New York all over the place. Some of them in Newark, in Jersey City, in Patterson. Getting on welfare in New York is so easy that people figure you have to be a fool not to take advantage of it.
We had people in the police department who were collecting welfare. They would travel and they would register in Manhattan, they'd register in the Bronx, they'd register in Queens, and they go out to Nassau County. Or they go to Westchester County, or they go to northern New Jersey. We had people collecting 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Their job was collecting welfare.
When Giuliani requires people to show up for work, I'd say about 40% just throw in the towel. This has been a good scam as long as it lasted, but it's over. You know, they have jobs. They're not going to not show up at work because they have to rake leaves in the park.
We actually did home visits. So we would have our investigators go out, and if somebody was on welfare, we'd go out, see if they were there, if that was their real address, and if they were at home. And that reduced fraud tremendously.
Welfare reform in New York City, that was where it was worst, and that's where we ended up making it the best.
The peak year of welfare dependency in New York City was March of 1995, when it reached 1.2 million New Yorkers, to end at 425,000 through 2001.
These changes weren't on paper, they weren't cold statistics. They involved real blocks, real communities, real neighborhoods, improving the quality of life in those neighborhoods for the most poor individuals in those neighborhoods. And that happened all over the city.
The city owned 60% of the land mass of Harlem, which meant every other building you walked past was owned by the city or abandoned or burnt down or vacant lots.
Giuliani brings into office with him a gal named Debbie Wright, who sees the problem and is quick to respond. And she goes about reviving neighborhoods by selling off these properties to people who use them more productively.
I think both Mayor Giuliani and Debbie Wright shared the perspective of having properties back in private hands. And she convinced the mayor that she would do it in her own way, which would be no displacement of tenants. The second thing she really pushed on was that she wanted the private sector owners to be local owners, not speculators. Before Debbie Wright, the law required that if a private owner did not pay his or her real estate taxes, the city would foreclose and take ownership and management of those buildings. She invented the law that said it went straight to the private owner with subsidies for affordability, and it skipped the whole city piece that was costing so much money. By turning this back over to the private sector with the subsidies to make them affordable, we now had stable, safe, clean, newly renovated housing in these neighborhoods. You now saw greater populations in what was a depopulated area. You saw retail opening back up on the ground floors. And you also saw commercial development on the major spines of these low-income neighborhoods. Many of these low-income neighborhoods are what are called food deserts. There really aren't supermarkets with fresh food available. The city put out for bid a development site requiring it to be a supermarket, and Pathmark ended up opening the first supermarket in East Harlem.
The value of houses in these kind of neighborhoods just skyrocketed everywhere in the city.
Many of the worst neighborhoods, whether it was the ABC block or Washington Heights or whatever, these became very desirable places to live. So I think it was a function of Giuliani becoming more aggressive about eliminating government control over those assets, but also making those assets far more valuable by simply creating a more livable city.
What Giuliani does, he revives upward mobility in New York. Part of that through real estate, part of that through simply making the city safe for people who are doing honest work. Because crime had been reduced, public life had been expanded. People were on the streets. You could walk at all hours. What's important is that there's a sense the ungovernable city is no longer ungovernable, that reforms are possible. And the sense of fear that pervaded the city is no longer there.
Throughout the city, Giuliani tried to impose the statistical methodology in other areas as well.
We were conducting Comstat meetings twice a week. We started seeing housing, sanitation, corrections showing up at the meetings, and then they sat, they took their notes, and they improved those operations in their own agencies.
We reduced violence in the most violent jail in the country, Rikers Island, by 90% by using a version of Comstat. We changed the entire way in which we paid sanitation workers. We didn't pay them by the hour. We gave them per day an amount they had to pick up as the base. Anything over that, they get more money. You can't imagine how productive they became. They didn't bother to take lunch. The sanitation department turned around completely.
There had been homeless encampments that Koch had started to wipe out, and the Giuliani administration went after these vigorously.
Giuliani's policy on those with regard to street homeless was that if you're on the street and you've got a sign that says, "I need help," we're going to send somebody out to give you help. And that help is going to include moving you into a facility that either can provide soup or a meal or bed and housing, and not allowing you to just wallow on 58th Street.
I believe Giuliani's first term was the most significant in modern New York history. There were 2,000 murders when he took office. After 4 years, there were something around 700.
I wrote a profile of Giuliani for The New Yorker when he ran for re-election. And he was running against a woman named Ruth Messenger, who was a classic liberal. And I said that Messenger's campaign was like a swallow being devoured by a threshing machine. Rudy was going to be re-elected mayor.
We have 330,000 fewer people on welfare than 2.5 years ago. This year, when it ends, if God is good, will be the safest year, even safer than last year, in 30 years in New York City.
I think he got something like 57% of the vote, which was a remarkable landslide for a Republican in New York.
Thank you, New York, for re-electing me to a job that I love so much.
And you know, with politicians, when they have a great first term, they lose some perspective. In fact, many of them lose an awful lot of perspective. That's why second terms usually aren't very good.
Now, in his second term, Giuliani tries to tackle school reform, but fails. It's a very tough road to hoe. He pushes toward mayoral control of the schools.
The system was failing the majority of students. And so you would put money in the Board of Education, and by the time it got filtered through to the classroom, there was very little left. And then also, because you had a system that was essentially a monopoly, you didn't have a lot of external pressure in trying to get change. And Rudy's approach to education was he wanted to have more control of it. And we made efforts to try and make sure the funding went to the kids. Another part of it was to set up targeted programs. Rudy was a great believer in having arts in the schools, and so we created Project Arts to bring arts education back into the schools. The other piece that Rudy realized is you had to give parents options. From a parent's point of view, to be forced to send your kid to a school that doesn't work has to be one of the most dispiriting things. We created a privately funded school voucher program.
I wanted the parents to be given the money that I was spending on their child. And I wanted them to decide where to put that money. Public school, private school, parochial school, charter school. And I wanted them to vote out of existence the public schools that they knew were inadequate. Because a lot of them would choose the public schools, but they choose a different public school.
There was also a tremendous amount of corruption in these local school boards. Principalships were bought and sold. You had to kick back to political campaigns in order to get a principalship, because the one thing the local school boards did control was the appointment of principals. There were terrible stories in the 1990s. A principal in the South Bronx found passed out in their car from crack cocaine. A principal who was stealing the cookie money that the PTA had raised.
Another reason that schools were not working the way they should. The schools were actually as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than the communities around them. And one thing we were able to do is merge these school safety officers into the police department, and the schools became safer.
By the end of the 90s, there is a consensus view in New York City that the Board of Education had failed and needed to be replaced. This law to create mayoral control of the school system had to pass the legislature in Albany. So the legislature, towards the end of Giuliani's term, the last couple of years, was saying publicly, we believe in mayoral control, but we're not going to give it to Rudy.
I just want to tell you, it was like a transformation of Mayor Giuliani from one citizen to a great mayor. I want to tell you, you've done an extraordinary job, and the people across this country Autumn, this is New York City. This is an unsolicited testimonial to try to get you to look prison.
Rudy had done something that most people thought was impossible. By the 1990s, New York was not just a preferred destination, but it was the capital of the world again. Everybody wanted to be here. You know, they started coming back from Iowa and places like that. And Rudy had a right to take credit for that. But Rudy also had a responsibility to see what he had accomplished in perspective. And in my experience, that's one of the toughest things for a politician to do.
It did seem that he lost interest. There was talk that he would run for senator against Hillary Clinton. He also was divorcing his wife in a very acrimonious and public scenario that was unpleasant for everybody.
His style of governance didn't suit everybody, and he started to rankle people quite a bit.
I think part of what happened was there were 2 or 3 different cases in the 90s where prisoners were brutalized or shot for pulling a piece of gum out of their pocket. And politics always is an ebb and flow. Most New Yorkers loved the fact that the police had gotten more effective in fighting crime. Most New Yorkers also were appalled by the excesses, and especially when it involved the police vamping on innocent black people.
The attention on the bread and butter issues that had marked his first term was not entirely missing, but it was not as intense.
It wasn't that people had gotten tired of Rudy's policies. They had gotten tired of Rudy. If they'd gotten tired of Rudy's policies, Mike Bloomberg would never have been elected mayor. We had, in effect, 2 Republican mayors in a row. It hasn't happened since the early 19th century. And the reason why it happened was because most people in the city, including blacks and Latinos, wanted safety and they wanted more effective government. They didn't like the excesses and they didn't like Rudy's excesses. But they liked the policies.
By the time of primary election in 2001, people were pretty ready for a change. Unfortunately, the Democratic primary that year, September 11th, 2001, so they had to postpone it because that was the same day that the major terrorist attacks occurred and the Twin Towers were destroyed.
New York is still here. We're here now. We're going to be here tomorrow. The World Financial Center is still here. They're not going to stop us. We've undergone tremendous losses, and we're going to grieve for them horribly. But New York is going to be here tomorrow morning, and it's going to be here forever.
This was a huge shock for New York, obviously. Somehow it resurrected Giuliani. He came to be known as America's mayor, because in this moment of fear and crisis, when the President of the United States was sort of not to be seen or found, nobody knew where he was, and it didn't seem like anybody knew what was going on, Giuliani actually, even though he was a lame duck mayor, he was only going to be in for another 3 months, he took command.
For sure. I think that's one. That's one, I believe. Yeah. That's what's left. There's one. The North Tower. The rest of it hollowed out, driven into the ground.
And even people who didn't like him saw that he wasn't afraid to go downtown and take control of the situation, and it was impressive.
One of the things he has done is he's prepared the city for emergency measures.
So in 1993, when the World Trade Center attack happened, I think he was one of the few who understood this was part of a larger plot against the United States, and he recognized that New York would be a target.
Mayor Giuliani had a vision to hire an independent expert, and he hired Jerry Hauer as the first commissioner of the Office of Emergency Management, which ended up really helping dramatically in the aftermath of 9/11. There's no police department, no fire department agency that would have been able to handle that coordination on the scale that had to be done. Steel workers, ambulance, private ambulance, city ambulance. The whole mix was incredible.
Not everything went well The command center is located in the World Trade Center, which comes down. There was another command center in Brooklyn that became the centerpiece of the response efforts. The city responds well to the 9/11 crisis.
You know, at one point he suggested that perhaps he should be allowed to continue to serve as mayor, but that was rejected. But he did throw his support behind Bloomberg. At the time, it was really a question whether New York was going to come back. 3,000 people died on 9/11. People thought, well, nobody's going to want to stay in Manhattan. Bloomberg was not expected to win. He was a billionaire from Boston who just seemed like he would try to buy his way to an election. Nobody was particularly fond of him. But at this moment of crisis, a law and order, business-friendly Republican, Bloomberg managed to win the election, I think on the strength of his promise of continuity and stability, which New Yorkers were hungry for at that moment.
History shows, I think as far back as we can go, that freedom is fragile, that you will always have to fight to protect it.
Mike Bloomberg's greatest attribute as a mayor was his managerial abilities. He was a very demanding manager. He expected a lot from you.
He was self-made. I mean, he's a very impressive figure. He did have this wartime mayor aspect that he had been forced to assume. He had to make sure that the city's finances stayed good. One of the first things he did was start fining everybody. He would fine small businesses for leaving a milk carton outside. This kind of thing sort of annoyed people quite a bit, but he wanted to make sure that the city could still pay its bills. He worked overtime to comfort and make big business feel like they should stay, that he would do everything he could to keep New York a secure place. To that end, Ray Kelly, his police commissioner, had a deep counterterrorism response.
I was a U.S. Customs Commissioner. I did that till the end of the Clinton administration, went to Bear Stearns, was there until the election of Michael Bloomberg. He asked me to come back as a police commissioner, which I did for 12 years.
The moment 9/11 happened, we had an entire redesign and how every major police department began to look at police in the fight against terrorism.
Well, New York City was let down twice by the federal government. They had the attacks in '93, and of course, you had the horrific events of 9/11. They failed us, and I had been in the federal government, so I had a lot of experience. I had a lot of knowledge of the skill sets that lay in the federal government.
Pre-9/11, policing was really not engaged with counterterrorism intelligence. Post 9/11, you went through this period where Ray Kelly said, sorry, that's what we're going to do.
We developed the most diverse police department in the world. We have police officers born in 106 countries. No police department anywhere could come close to that. But that's a tremendous language and cultural reservoir that I wanted to use. So I started out, I had a butcher block paper, and I drew the things that I wanted to do, the counterterrorism operation, the intelligence operation. There was issues with anthrax. We needed infectious disease doctors, that sort of thing.
Under Ray Kelly, the NYPD had become a much more forward deployed police department. So that allowed them to make this transition to what we call first preventers.
Cops are great, they'll do what you tell them to do, but they didn't have the foundation to do a lot of things that I was thinking of. How do you do intelligence gathering? What language skills should we be applying? That sort of thing.
Imagine a police department saying, thanks FBI, thanks CIA, appreciate the info. By the way, I have 13 of my own sources around the world, uniformed NYPD police officers sitting in police capitals, collecting intel. So the FBI agent looking at a bombing in Spain, for example, sees one thing, a CIA officer sees another. The NYPD liaison sees the third. He sees how the glass shards became very dangerous and how we had to think about that with our subway systems. He sees how the police missed certain trails of locals and how they can fix that back in New York. We're not just a local police department that's going to give speeding tickets and DWIs and police drugs and domestic violence. We are a counterterrorism department.
I had lunch with Ray Kelly during that era, and in terms of terrorism, I think a lot of us felt that it was inevitable. And I said that to Ray Kelly, and Kelly said, not to me, and he said, we're doing everything we can to make sure it never happens, and we will never believe that it's inevitable. And I was really proud that he was our police commissioner. I mean, what a wonderful view of his obligation and duty to New York. And I think that in many ways typified a lot of what the Bloomberg administration was about. It was about moving forward, getting things done.
And that's why we have 1,000 police officers dedicated to counterterrorism and intelligence. That's why we have 35,000 uniformed cops on the street to keep us safe, and we have done it.
Mayor Bloomberg wanted to take money from the police budget and give it to the Department of Education. I argued against that strenuously. I think, to be quite candid, that Mayor Bloomberg knew that Rudy Giuliani was the crime fighter, he was the 9/11 hero. He wanted to make his mark in some other area. So he took those resources and put them in the Department of Education.
Bloomberg's most significant accomplishment was that he wrested control of the schools away from the Board of Education and centered it completely in the person of the mayor.
So now the mayor directly appoints the head of the school system, the school's chancellor, and he or she can remove the school's chancellor without going through a board.
That was a major thing. And he brought in Joe Klein, who I think was an excellent chancellor.
I became chancellor in a very fluky kind of a way. Only a guy like Mike Bloomberg would pick a guy like Joel Klein. And the way it happened was I had recently left the Clinton administration where I was running the antitrust division. I had sued Microsoft. So I had a pretty high profile at that time. And he called me and said, let's talk. And I said, Mike, you sure this is the right number you dial? I mean, I went to the schools, But long story short, he and I hit it off. The kids who grew up in places like Bed-Stuy and Harlem and the South Bronx, the kids who grew up, in other words, in high poverty communities, mostly children of color, were getting not remotely the kind of education they needed to succeed. And a 50% graduation rate over a decade is not sustainable.
They created a tremendous number of new public schools to replace the failing schools that they had closed. Demonstrably, the test scores went up. The graduation rate, after being stuck around 50% for 20 years, in the next 10 to 12 year period, got up into the 70s. It's now about 77% kids graduate on time.
I attribute that to 3 or 4 big things that we did under Bloomberg's leadership. First of all, we instituted much greater accountability. We're going to measure the impact of your work on student learning. Put a letter grade on every school. A school would be an A school, a B school, based on its performance. Second thing we did was we gave a lot more money for teacher salaries, attracted better and better people coming to the system. We brought in things like coaches, that we did a lot more teacher preparation. And finally, and I think probably in some ways the most important thing, we started to focus on the principal as the key leader.
Principals can now hire people. So now they can't say, I got this failing teacher that was transferred out, they weren't satisfied. No, that's a very important piece. If you want accountability, you got to give the institution a degree of autonomy.
He also pushed through charter schools. Charter schools are public schools that are run separately from the education chancellor, fully funded by the taxes, but they're non-unionized generally. And they can operate, with alternative curricula, alternative teaching models, and some of them have been wildly successful.
I knew that the forces that own the status quo were not going to be happy. So what I did basically was set out to go get the great charter networks I knew would be high performing. If you bring in a bunch of schools that don't work, parents aren't going to choose them, you're not going to get anywhere.
The lack of physical space for charter schools was a big impediment, but Bloomberg and Klein took care of that. It's a public asset. They said, we'll provide you space within the public schools, free of charge.
And my view was, but the space belonged to the kids, not to the adult, not to the politician.
In 2000, there were about 3,000 students in charter schools in New York City. By the end of the Klein and Bloomberg era, there are over 100,000 students. 10% of the population are in charter schools.
And mostly adopted a philosophy that just asked for forgiveness, not for permission. And so a lot of times I just put my foot on the gas and said, we're going to open up 30 charter schools this year. And we did it. And by the time everybody kind of looked around, they said, what the hell just happened? And we were saying, oh, it's done. We got sued and we got fights and on and on and on. But I am so convinced by the history of this that the performance of those schools justified every fight we had. And if anything, I wish we had done more, because today there are still 50,000 children, mostly black and brown children, still on the waiting lists for charter schools in New York. Those kids deserve better than they're getting right now from the city.
New Yorkers felt this was a new golden era where we had peace and prosperity at the same time. Very unusual, and New Yorkers loved it.
He enhances real estate development by rezoning much of the city.
He allowed developers free rein to redevelop parts of Manhattan. Hudson Yards was a Bloomberg project, and he built the High Line, Freedom Tower, the replacement of the World Trade Center. This all bears the Bloomberg stamp.
Bloomberg continues most of Giuliani's policies.
My job was to help continue to administer the social services programs, building on the changes that had been made by my predecessor, Jason Turner. I kept it going, it was working. There's no need to change just because you want to put your own name on it. And that was very consistent with Mike Bloomberg's attitude too. He wasn't into ego or making a new name or showing that you're different or better. The city's economy was strong, and so we instituted policies that freed up the business community to hire and to employ people and to grow. And so we lived off the growth of the tourism industry, the restaurant industry, the healthcare industry, that we're hiring people. Philosophically, we just kept going. Work over welfare. That's what I did. And Mayor Bloomberg and the team at City Hall stood behind us all the way.
Bloomberg continued to push murders down. One of the innovations they really took advantage of was stop, question, and frisk. Stop, question, frisk is police can detain someone and quickly search them to see if they're carrying anything just for the protection of the police officer. And this was applied, some would say indiscriminately.
He pushes stop and frisk policing much too hard. It produces an overreaction.
It is time to end stop and frisk. 14 years ago, we thought Rudolph Giuliani was out of control and he was only doing $80,000 a year. Last year, Bloomberg did almost $700,000 a year.
You know, people say stop and frisk was criminal. And in 2013, stop and frisk was struck down as unconstitutional, and crime continued to drop.
You had neighborhoods that had become so safe that you had two-parent families moving in that brought stability, that were eyes on the street, that were serving the role of police officers. Police is always the second best solution to urban disorder. The best solution is families. So New York managed to keep crime low because the demographics of high crime neighborhoods had changed.
It could be the biggest victim yet of the global credit crisis, a loss that would send shockwaves through the world's banking system.
This is an extraordinary period for America's economy.
As our economic situation has become increasingly unstable, the question to me has become far less about the theoretical and much more about the practical. and I have directed my staff to work with her staff to produce a new term limits bill. If the council passes it, I will sign it, and I would plan to run for re-election.
Bloomberg was term limited. He was only supposed to have 2 terms in office. He not only spent an enormous amount on his elections, but he would spend untold amounts more just buying the good opinion or the silence of everyone in the city. Like every cultural institution, every political organization, every advocate like Al Sharpton, people like that, they all got checks. So he essentially, could do whatever he wanted.
When Bloomberg wanted to run for a 3rd term against and overturn term limits, there was a lot of ambivalence. And I know a lot of us who thought he was a very good mayor didn't like the idea that he would spend all of this money to overturn term limits.
The people of New York City made their choice on 2 occasions. Back in '93 and in '96, voters overwhelmingly voted to enforce and put in place term limits. Mike Bloomberg has overturned term limits for his own self-interest.
Somebody asked him, what's your philosophy of government? And he said, well, I'm not a philosopher, I'm an engineer. And so he didn't really believe that a set of principles that were thrown out there on a regular basis through a political movement were necessary. It was a revolution which was not articulated and preserved through some kind of formal political process, a party. A group of people say, if you believe these things, vote for us. That got diluted, and I think that was fatally wrong. So that when he left office, and he left the city in pretty good shape, there was no one to take his place. It was a total vacuum, and that's why the old political forces moved in so quickly and so easily. You need a good manager with a philosophy of government so that people understand the values that are driving what you're trying to accomplish.
The rejuvenation of the city proceeded. New York became the safest big city in America. It was gleaming prosperity, attracting just record numbers of tourists who wanted to come and be part of this New York. It's hard to deny it was a successful 3rd term.
I think this administration and the city council together have every reason to be proud of what we've done in the last 12 years.
The things that we accomplished in the Bloomberg administration, I'm proud of those accomplishments, and I think they made a difference in the city, big difference.
By 1990, liberalism had become stale. It had become reactionary, become based on principles that no longer applied. It needed to be reformed through the use of market principles like choice. It needed to be reformed in terms of the work rules that public servants served under. Civil service needed to be reformed. The system had to be opened up because in 1990, New York was a city that was run for the benefit of its employees, not for the benefit of its citizens. By the end of Bloomberg, New York was a city that was being run for the benefit of its citizens once more. Not that it was perfect, not that there isn't more that can be done. But at least we now know that there is a path to get there.
I think to sum up the 20 years of Giuliani and Bloomberg is to say they had achieved what people thought was impossible. People thought it couldn't happen.
There was no palpable fear of living in any neighborhood. You could take the subway at any time of night. You could send your children to the store and there was no worry about what was going to happen. So, I mean, maybe it's too obvious how precious, orderly, safe neighborhoods are for the working people and the middle class who've always been the backbone of the city. Public space is just so important. And Giuliani and Bloomberg, for whatever their faults, they did give New Yorkers a city where You could feel safe, and it was possible to get a job and live just a normal life.
So many people on the left, including in the media, and God bless us, the New York Times, will never forgive Rudy Giuliani for being successful. They didn't like his personality, they didn't like his point of view, so they were not really ready to acknowledge much of anything. The experience of the Giuliani term was the result of real efforts and real ideas by real people, and it didn't just happen. And if you don't really understand that legacy, you're doomed to watch it fall apart before your very eyes.
A lot of the change in perception about what a city can do and what a government should be that we created has created new neighborhoods. Brooklyn has exploded. There are new neighborhoods in the Bronx. And for a city to survive, it's got to grow. And who thought that New York City could get bigger? Well, it's getting bigger by taking areas that never viewed themselves as neighborhoods and turning them into vibrant communities. And I think those developments in the city, that growth of the city, a lot of that has to be credited to Rudy because he made the city a place that people believed had a future.
One of the things that's true about the revival of New York, the mayor, policy thinkers like the Manhattan Institute and others created a framework. It's not enough to simply say to people, well, you have a choice. Somebody has to take risks to do that. And that occurred from people in New York City of all political stripes to step in and create new schools, work with the police to make the streets safer, develop innovative approaches. You need everyone involved in this.
And we proved everybody wrong because in the late 80s, there were very few people that thought that New York could be turned around.
Bye.